The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 20. The End of the Curve of Reason. In the realm of thought, that does not matter, for as there the reason does not drive at practice, it is able with impunity to allow the most opposite viewpoints and systems to exist side by side, to compare them, seek for reconciliations, synthesize in the most various ways, change constantly, enlarge, elevate. It is free to act without thinking at every point of immediate practical consequences. But when the reason seeks to govern life, it is obliged to fix its viewpoint, to crystallize its system. Every change becomes, or at least seems, a thing doubtful, difficult, and perilous, all the consequences of which cannot be foreseen, while the conflict of viewpoints, principles, systems leads to strife and revolution, and not to a basis of harmonious development. The reason mechanizes in order to arrive at a fixity of conduct and practice amid the fluidity of things. But while mechanism is a sufficient principle in dealing with physical forces, because it is in harmony with the law or dharma of physical nature, it can never truly succeed in dealing with conscious life, because there it is contrary to the law of life, its highest dharma. While then, the attempt at a rational ordering of society is an advance upon the comparative immobility and slow subconscious or half-conscious evolution of infrarational societies and the confusedly mixed movement of semi-rational societies. It can never arrive at perfection by its own methods, because reason is neither the first principle of life, nor can be its last, supreme, and sufficient principle. The question remains whether anarchistic thought, supervening upon the collectivistic, can any more successfully find a satisfying social principle. For if it gets rid of mechanism, the one practical means of a rationalizing organization of life, on what will it build, and with what can it create? It may be contended, as against the anarchistic objection, that the collectivist period is, if not the last and best, at least a necessary stage in social progress. For the vice of individualism is that in insisting upon the free development and self-expression of the life and the mind, or the life-soul in the individual, it tends to exaggerate the egoism of the mental and vital being, and prevent the recognition of unity with others, on which alone a complete self-development and a harmless freedom can be founded. Collectivism, at least, insists upon that unity by entirely subordinating the life of the isolated ego to the life of the greater group ego. And its office may be thus to stamp upon the mentality and life habits of the individual the necessity of unifying his life with the life of others. Afterwards, when again the individual asserts his freedom, as someday he must, he may have learned to do it on the basis of this unity, and not on the basis of his separate egoistic life. This may well be the intention of nature in human society, in its movement towards a collectivist principle of social living. Collectivism may itself, in the end, realize this aim, if it can modify its own dominant principle far enough to allow for a free individual development on the basis of unity and a closely harmonized common existence. But to do that, it must first spiritualize itself and transform the very soul of its inspiring principle. It cannot do it on the basis of the logical reason and the mechanically scientific ordering of life. Anarchistic thought, although it has not yet found any sure form, cannot but develop in proportion as the pressure of society on the individual increases, since there is something in that pressure which unduly oppresses a necessary element of human perfection. We need not attach much importance to the grosser, vitalistic, or violent anarchism which seeks forcibly to react against the social principle, or claims the right of man to live his own life, in quotes, in the egoistic or crudely vitalistic sense. But there is a higher and intellectual anarchistic thought, which in its aim and formula recovers and carries to its furthest logical conclusions a very real truth of nature and of the divine in man. In its revolt against the opposite exaggeration of the social principle, we find it declaring that all government of man by the power of compulsion is an evil, a violation, a suppression or deformation of a natural principle of good, which would otherwise grow and prevail for the perfection of the human race. Even the social principle in itself is questioned and held liable for a sort of fall in man from a natural to an unnatural and artificial principle of living. The exaggeration and inherent weakness of this exclusive idea are sufficiently evident. Man does not actually live as an isolated being, nor can he grow by an isolated freedom. He grows by his relations with others, and his freedom must exercise itself in a progressive self-harmonizing with the freedom of his fellow beings. The social principle, therefore, apart from the forms it has taken, would be perfectly justified, if by nothing else than by the need of society as a field of relations which afford to the individual his occasion for growing towards a greater perfection. We have, indeed, the old dogma that man was originally innocent and perfect, the conception of the first ideal state of mankind as a harmonious felicity of free and natural living in which no social law or compulsion existed, because none was needed, is as old as the Mahabharata. But even this theory has to recognize a downward lapse of man from his natural perfection. The fall was not brought about by the introduction of the social principle in the arrangement of his life, but rather the social principle and the governmental method of compulsion had to be introduced as a result of the fall. If, on the contrary, we regard the evolution of man not as a fall from perfection, but a gradual ascent, a growth out of the infrarational status of his being, it is clear that only by a social compulsion on the vital and physical instincts of his infrarational egoism, a subjection to the needs and laws of the social life, could this growth have been brought about on a large scale. For in their first crudeness, the infrarational instincts do not correct themselves quite voluntarily, without the pressure of need and compulsion, but only by the erection of a law other than their own, which teaches them finally to erect a yet greater law within, for their own correction and purification. The principle of social compulsion may not have been always, or perhaps ever used quite wisely. It is a law of man's imperfection, imperfect in itself, and must always be imperfect in its method and result. But in the earliest stages of his evolution, it was clearly inevitable. And until man has grown out of the causes of its necessity, he cannot be really ready for the anarchistic principle of living. But it is at the same time clear that the more the outer law is replaced by an inner law, the nearer man will draw to his true and natural perfection. And the perfect social state must be one in which governmental compulsion is abolished, and man is able to live with his fellow man by free agreement and cooperation. But by what means is he to be made ready for this great and difficult consummation? Intellectual anarchism relies on two powers in the human being, of which the first is the enlightenment of his reason. The mind of man, enlightened, will claim freedom for itself, but will equally recognize the same right in others. A just equation will of itself emerge on the ground of a true, self-found, and unperverted human nature. This might conceivably be sufficient, although hardly without a considerable change and progress in man's mental powers, if the life of the individual could be lived in a predominant isolation, with only a small number of points of necessary contact with the lives of others. Actually, our existence is closely knit with the existences around us. And there is a common life, a common work, a common effort and aspiration, without which humanity cannot grow to its full height and wideness. To ensure coordination and prevent clash and conflict, in this constant contact, another power is needed than the enlightened intellect. Anarchistic thought finds this power in a natural human sympathy, which, if it is given free play under the right conditions, can be relied upon to ensure natural cooperation. The appeal is to what the American poet calls the love of comrades, to the principle of fraternity, the third and most neglected term of the famous revolutionary formula. A free equality founded upon spontaneous cooperation, not on governmental force and social compulsion, is the highest anarchistic ideal. This would seem to lead us either towards a free cooperative communism, a unified life where the labor and property of all is there for the benefit of all, or else to what may better be called communalism, the free consent of the individual to live in a society where the just freedom of his individuality will be recognized, but the surplus of his labor and acquisitions will be used or given by him without demur for the common good under a natural cooperative impulse. The severest school of anarchism rejects all compromise with communism. It is difficult to see how a stateless communism, which is supposed to be the final goal of the Russian ideal, can operate on the large and complex scale necessitated by modern life. And indeed, it is not clear how even a free communalism could be established or maintained without some kind of governmental force and social compulsion, or how it could fail to fall away in the end either on one side into a rigorous collectivism, or on the other to struggle, anarchy, and disruption. For the logical mind, in building its social idea, takes no sufficient account of the infrarational element in man. The vital egoism, to which the most active and effective part of his nature is bound. That is his most constant motive, and it defeats in the end all the calculations of the idealizing reason, undoes its elaborate systems, or accepts only the little that it can assimilate to its own need and purpose. If that strong element, that ego force in him, is too much overshadowed, cowed, and depressed, too much rationalized, too much denied an outlet, then the life of man becomes artificial, top-heavy, poor in the sap of vitality, mechanical, uncreative. And on the other hand, if it is not suppressed, it tends in the end to assert itself and derange the plans of the rational side of man, because it contains in itself powers whose right satisfaction, or whose final way of transformation, reason cannot discover. If reason were the secret highest law of the universe, or if man, the mental being, were limited by mentality, it might be possible for him, by the power of the reason, to evolve out of the dominance of infrarational nature, which he inherits from the animal. He could then live securely in his best human self as a perfected, rational, and sympathetic being, balanced and well-ordered in all parts, the sattvic man of Indian philosophy. That would be his summit of possibility, his consummation. But his nature is rather transitional. The rational being is only a middle term of nature's evolution. A rational satisfaction cannot give him safety from the pull below, nor deliver him from the attraction from above. If it were not so, the ideal of intellectual anarchism might be more feasible, as well as acceptable, as a theory of what human life might be in its reasonable perfection. But man, being what he is, we are compelled in the end to aim higher and go farther. A spiritual or spiritualized anarchism might appear to come nearer to the real solution, or at least touch something of it from afar. As it expresses itself at the present day, there is much in it that is exaggerated and imperfect. Its seers seem often to preach an impossible self-abnegation of the vital life, and an asceticism which, instead of purifying and transforming the vital being, seeks to suppress and even kill it. Life itself is impoverished or dried up by this severe austerity in its very springs. Carried away by a high-reaching spirit of revolt, these prophets denounce civilization as a failure because of its vitalistic exaggerations, but set up an opposite exaggeration which might well cure civilization of some of its crying faults and uglinesses, but would deprive us also of many real and valuable gains. But apart from these excesses of a too logical thought and a one-sided impulsion, apart from the inability of any ism to express the truth of spirit, which exceeds all such compartments, we seem here to be near to the real way out, to the discovery of the saving motive force. The solution lies not in the reason, but in the soul of man, in its spiritual tendencies. It is a spiritual, an inner freedom that can alone create a perfect human order. It is a spiritual, a greater than the rational enlightenment that can alone illumine the vital nature of man and impose harmony on its self-seekings, antagonisms, and discords. A deeper brotherhood, a yet unfound law of love, is the only sure foundation possible for a perfect social evolution. No other can replace it. But this brotherhood and love will not proceed by the vital instincts or the reason, where they can be met, baffled, or deflected by opposite reasonings and other discordant instincts. Nor will it found itself in the natural heart of man, where there are plenty of other passions to combat it. It is in the soul that it must find its roots, the love which is founded upon a deeper truth of our being, the brotherhood, or let us say, for this is another feeling than any vital or mental sense of brotherhood, a calmer, more durable motive force, the spiritual comradeship which is the expression of an inner realization of oneness. For so only can egoism disappear, and the true individualism of the unique Godhead in each man found itself on the true communism of the equal Godhead in the race. For the Spirit, the inmost self, the universal Godhead in every being, is that whose very nature of diverse oneness it is to realize the perfection of its individual life and nature in the existence of all, in the universal life and nature. This is a solution to which it may be objected that it puts off the consummation of a better human society to a far-off date in the future evolution of the race. For it means that no machinery invented by the reason can perfect either the individual or the collective man. An inner change is needed in human nature, a change too difficult to be ever effected except by the few. This is not certain, but in any case, if this is not the solution, then there is no solution. If this is not the way, then there is no way for the humankind. Then the terrestrial evolution must pass beyond man as it has passed beyond the animal, and a greater race must come that will be capable of the spiritual change. A form of life must be born that is nearer to the divine. After all, there is no logical necessity for the conclusion that the change cannot begin at all because its perfection is not immediately possible. A decisive turn of mankind to the spiritual ideal, the beginning of a constant ascent and guidance towards the heights, may not be altogether impossible, even if the summits are attainable at first only by the pioneer few and far off to the tread of the race. And that beginning may mean the descent of an influence that will alter at once the whole life of mankind in its orientation, and enlarge forever, as did the development of his reason, and more than any development of the reason, its potentialities and all its structure.